I'm really pleased to be here today with Tatiana Fraser, co-founder of MetaLab, as well as System Sanctuary. Welcome, Tatiana. I would like to just go over her bio briefly before we begin, as it's such a pleasure to share her experience with you. She co-founded MetaLab. It's a platform designed to support and incubate systems innovation, where she recently launched System Sanctuary, a global peer learning platform for systems leadership and the Gender Lab. She is an award-winning innovator and published author with over 20 years of experience leading and scaling social innovation aimed to advance girls' and women's leadership and empowerment. She is also co-founder and past executive director of Girls Action Foundation and co-author of Girl Positive, which was published by Random House in 2016. Tatiana is recognized as an Ashoka Fellow and one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by Women's Executive Network, and has served on numerous boards and advisory committees, including the UN Commission on the Status of Women, president of CKX and the Carroll Institute, treasurer for Food Secure Canada, vice president of Execo, and director of Actua, among others. Tatiana is also a mother and loves running, doing yoga, and spending time by the ocean. We can all really take a page out of your playbook on how to balance and relax between all those incredible accomplishments and all the creative projects that you get to do. So we're so happy to engage with you today in the discussion around feminist practices and systems change. Thank you for being here. Before we get into the depth of the presentation and discussion, we're here today to discuss. Can you please just tell me a little bit more about your current work and what led us here today to talk about feminist practice and systems change?
Wonderful. Hi, Pamela. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today and with everyone on the call to talk about systems practice, systems change, and to bring into kind of the discourse a feminist lens. So just by way of just a bit of context, so my background is in gender equity. As co-founder of Girls Action Foundation, I started a grassroots organization 20 years ago and scaled that to become a national organization. And at the same time, I was also very fortunate to study complexity theory and social innovation under Frances Wesley, who is an amazing thought leader around systems change in Canada, and Brenda Zimmerman as well. And that learning really informed the work I did with Girls Action over the many years. And I stepped away from that work about 7 years ago. And when I did, I was very preoccupied with questions around systems change, because I knew intuitively that doing gender equity work and being part of that movement, that we were acting on systemic issues. We were doing systems change, but we didn't have the framework and the tools to articulate it, to measure it, to build frameworks around it. So I left kind of obsessed a bit about systems change and went on a learning journey with other senior leaders across the country to really take a deep dive into, like, how are we doing systems change and what are we learning about it? And as I went through that journey, two things. I was very preoccupied also with creating opportunities for practitioners to learn from each other, recognizing that we don't have the answers for systems change. If we did, we'd solve all the problems that we're all grappling with. So I come at this with an approach that recognizes that we learn through the doing, and that practitioners, if we can connect our learning together, we can kind of emerge a collective intelligence. So this is really the work I'm doing with System Sanctuary, where we host peer learning and capacity building opportunities and cohorts for systems leaders internationally in Canada. And at the same time, I also am doing work in the gender equity field, continuing to really push the envelope around how are we doing systems change in with a gender lens from a feminist perspective, and how can we leverage the systems change kind of field to support that work. So that's the kind of bridging I bring to systems change to help kind of set the context for the conversation today. Thanks, Pamela.
That is really fantastic, Tatiana. And I just love that we're going to get an opportunity today to discuss all of these learnings that you've experienced and all the chances you've had to practice these things and to reflect on them. So I'm really excited by this, and I hope all our listeners are as well. I'm just going to begin. Before we start, I'd like to just provide an overview of the discussion for everyone to help situate our conversation further for those who are participating today in the webinar. I'd like to first briefly just introduce concepts. We're going to go through a discussion that will focus on concepts relevant to the discussions around systems change specifically and what it means to work at scale, how we're thinking about these things, how you've been thinking about these things, Tatiana, and really trying to understand what are the key elements of systems change, how do we move this from thinking to practice, and what it takes as well to, what are some of the system leadership capabilities, and what do we mean by scaling? And I'm looking forward to hear more about this from you as well, and to be able to then situate what is the feminist practice within this context of systems change work that's going on. As well, we're then going to go through the actual doing and how we apply feminist practice to systems change work and how that works and what are some of the key learnings, the patterns and the impacts. And of course, the big question, why is this all so important? So we're looking forward to hearing from you further, Tatiana, right now. And before we do, I'd like to just remind everybody to, again, please, we're looking forward to feedback and questions from you. And you're welcome to write them in through the chat, as Duncan had mentioned, or the other ways of doing that. And we'll look forward to an interactive discussion at the end of the conversation. So I would like to first just ask you to, as a way of grounding the discussion, really to acknowledge that the listeners are coming to the webinar today from all different places and different types of work and sectors and likely varying degrees of experience. It seems pretty appropriate at this point to contextualize things by introducing first your understanding through the work you've been doing of these different concepts and what we're honing in on today. Can you provide us with that?
Certainly. Okay, great. Yes, and so we won't spend a lot of time on the concepts, but just by way of just setting some clarity around what we're talking about, we'll begin with the frame of what is systems thinking when we talk about systems change. And I think the most important foundational underpinning, theoretical underpinning, is that systems thinking takes the world as complex as its starting point. And so complexity theory and complexity thinking is at the basis of systems change and is a really important kind of foundational frame for us to start from. Next, we can say that systems thinking illuminates the interconnection of actors in a system, of dynamics in a system, and structures that exist within a system. So it's really looking at, when we're looking at a system, we're trying to see the interconnectivity between all of the parts. Another important element for systems approaches is that it takes the stakeholder and their involvement throughout the whole process of the work that we're doing. It also, it creates an opportunity to interpret systems with the purposes of identifying leverage points for change. So systems thinking, when we engage in trying to understand and sense make around systems, we can then move through to identify intervention points and action points to actually create change and impact change in that system. And it can be used as a basis for creating effective and long-term strategies for change. So when we're thinking about systems change, we're thinking about like the marathon. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We all know that systems change is difficult work. It's complex work. We don't have all the answers, but we need to be in it for the long term. Thank you, Pamela. So what is systems change? And just very briefly, it's a process designed to shift functions or structures in an identified system. And so when we're talking about systems change, that we are talking about influencing and impacting policies, routines, relationships, resources, power structures, and values. But we're also talking about a level of impact around culture, around mindsets. And so systems change also includes working at the level of people's attitudes, their values, their belief systems, assumptions, etc. So often, we can often assume that systems change is at the like policy level, but it's more than that. And it also includes kind of the cultural level as well. So when we're talking about systems practice, there are core concepts that inform systems approaches to systems change. And a lot of these can kind of come through systems thinking and complexity thinking. And we talk about concepts around emergence. So often we talk about emergent strategy. We're recognizing that we need to have kind of learning and information to inform our actions and how we're moving forward. There are core concepts around self-organization, concepts around interdependencies, concepts around unpredictability and non-linearity. So often, one of the ways to think about systems practice and thinking is moving away from like outdated ways of thinking, like Newtonian thinking, very, very rational, very linear, and moving into a different mindset that takes into account emergence, unpredictability, non-linearity. And one key point around systems practice is that we recognize that relationships are everything, that relationships are key and are a really important focus of the work that we do around systems change.
Oh, I love that. And I'd really like to talk about that further. And I think you raise really good points around the importance and value of relationships within this very complex system. And I think maybe we'll discuss that further later on.
Great. And so what I want to do is to now just shift our thinking to what are systems leadership capacities. And when we think about capacities, this is then getting into kind of the ideas around practice, like how are we doing systems change practice? Mm-hmm. And so we've developed kind of 5 bucket areas where we focus on identifying systems leadership capacities. And again, you can see in this framework that, you know, complexity and systems thinking underpin that. Then we have capacities, and then we have tools that support it. So we're not going to go too much into detail, but if you go to the next slide, I'll just do a quick overview. So when we're talking about systems leadership, for one, the first kind of area, we're thinking about seeing and sensing the system. And this allows us to look at root causes, the systemic nature of the problems we're trying to address. It helps us see different parts of the system and their patterns. When we're creating processes, and we often do this through mapping techniques, it helps us understand different perspectives in the system. So you really want to be engaging with diverse perspectives when you're doing this kind of exercise of seeing and sensing. It helps us to really deepen our understanding of the complexity of the issue, and it helps us to identify pathways that can lead towards action. So that's the first kind of area of practice. The second one, as we mentioned earlier, about relationships, building relationships and working across difference is a key practice area that can be very challenging. Often when we're working for change, we're working with like-minded people who share our worldviews and our values. And when we're doing systems work, it really challenges us to be working with, you know, new system actors that we're not necessarily comfortable with, and to be practicing working across difference, which is an area of practice that can be very, very challenging, but one that we want to be focusing on. Another key element is around adapting an emergent strategy, and we heard language around emergence earlier on. So as we're implementing systems change, as we're leading and working with others, we really need to be able to learn as we go, to have mechanisms that are feedback loops to feed into how we're doing what we're doing, and to be able to adapt. So structures that are, you know, very hierarchical or rigid have a really hard time. working in this way. So we want to be thinking about like, how are we nimble? How are we flexible? How are we adapting to the environment and the feedback loops in order for us to practice and continue to do our systems work? Another element is reflexivity. And this is really about being able to locate ourselves in the system. So when we're doing systems work, we're not looking at, you know, the system from the outside objectively. We actually, it's a subjective experience and we are part of the system. So this process of being able to locate ourselves, understand who we are in the system, and have that kind of reflective practice of ongoing learning, ongoing questioning, ongoing critical reflection is really important. And the last element is working at different levels of scale or multiple level strategies. And we can just go to the next slide for this one. So I'm introducing some of the frames here because we'll be coming back to them as we continue through the discussion. But multiple level strategies means that we're working at different levels within the system when we're embarking on systems change strategies. And this framework, which is might be familiar to some of the listeners, is Gill's transition theory. And what it does is it creates a framework for to understand where we're acting in the system. And it starts at the bottom level, the niche level. And this is where innovations might live, where new models are born, where new ideas are born. And I also like to think about this as where kind of community and local action happens. And then if you look one level up, we see the regime level. And this is where systems and structures exist, and where they are constantly kind of, their dynamic is a reinforcing dynamic. So when we're thinking about systems change, we're thinking about how are we influencing at that regime level. And then the next level up is the landscape level. And this is the area of values, of culture, of narrative. And so we won't go too deeply into this, but it's a wonderful framework to think about systems change. But what we want to recognize is that when we're doing systems change, we're working at multiple levels and our interventions are acting at different levels. And this is a framework to be used to think about how the dynamics of those interventions.
Right. It's really fantastic. And, you know, I'm thinking about this and looking at what we're talking about here on the screen. And I'm thinking maybe you can talk a bit more about the different levels of scale and give a little more context for the listeners about what these are and how they're interacting with each other.
Great, thanks. So yes, we also use frameworks around scale as a way to think about systems change. And in the literature and in the field of social innovation, systems change is, when we think about how are we doing it, it's often in the context of scaling up. So this is the area of changing institutions, policy, rules, and laws. And this, I guess there's an assumption that that's kind of the only pathway to systems change. But ideas around scaling out are also ways in which you can impact a system. And this is a strategy that's really about reaching more broadly. It's about like replicating an idea, disseminating an idea to impact more people and communities. Mm-hmm. And we can also think about scaling deep. And scaling deep is, there's not a lot of thinking that's been done on scaling deep, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but this is the level of working at the cultural roots. So it's looking at relationships, values, belief systems, etc. So this can be a helpful framework to think about strategy and to think about where you're focusing your energy.
So just in terms of the value of scaling deep, just getting back to the points that you're making before about relationships and how important it is to actually do the systems practice and doing this work. So if I understand correctly, we rely on relationships and cultural values and beliefs as essential to practice this authentic, strengthened, ethical way of doing this type of work. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. I think so. And I would say in the area of practice around systems change and thinking, it's one area that is it's tricky, because when we think about acting on culture, and we think about trying to influence, belief systems, this is very intangible. It's not concrete. And so it can be a challenging area to strategize, to act on. But there are leading kind of practitioners who are doing interesting work around this. And I think it also requires a level of a kind of humility also, because there's a lot of hubris, I suppose, in thinking like, oh, we can influence culture. I often think about Beyonce as an example, like she influences culture. Like, who are we to think that we can actually move in at that level? But it's an important aspect, and one that is really important to think about when we're doing systems change. And we'll talk more about that as we get through the framework.
Yeah, I suspect that now when we start to think about what is a feminist practice, you're going to start to introduce some of this further around what you're talking about. So please.
Yeah. So just the last concept to help us just ground our thinking. What is feminist practice? And if we just move to the next slide, as I mentioned earlier in the opening, feminist practice and gender equity has always kind of come at problems from a systems lens. And I think that's important to recognize, because when you're saying, okay, let's do systems change within a feminist equity context, a lot of people have already been doing decades of work at that systems level.
Right.
And I think we can also think about communities like Indigenous communities working for change come at, a lot of their approaches are systemic. So there's a recognition that, systems change, while there's new tools and frameworks to help us, we're blending this with work that, has already been rooted in trying to understand and act on systemic issues. So that's important. And then in feminist practice, we're looking at centering women's experiences, and we're bringing an intersectional approach to that. So what that means is that we recognize that, like when we center women's experiences, which have often not been included in, the views in terms of how we're creating the world or how we're solving problems, there's a recentering that happens. But there's also a recognition that it's not a difference between men and women, that women experience their lives in different ways, and bringing an intersectional lens recognizes intersections of race and class and Indigenous identity, ability, sexual identity, that all of these intersectional identities also impact the ways in which we experience the world. This is where it gets interesting, is that the values kind of inherent in feminist practice are very much aligned with systems approaches and complexity. So values around collaboration, around decentralized ways of organizing, around bringing on holistic view, valuing diversity, focusing on interconnection, again, on intersections, and focusing on relational. These values align with systems change. So this is where it gets interesting, and we'll again come back to that a little bit later. The other thing I think that's important to know around feminist practice is that there's a strong analysis around power, and that we're also moving away from like treating problems from an objective perspective and recognizing the subjectivity kind of in our engagement. So this is kind of just some framing around feminist practice.
So let's, this is all really getting very exciting, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the presentation. And I want to just contextualize, perhaps talk a little bit about where this initiative and these ideas have taken root, so that the audience knows and understands where this is all growing up, where this is growing from.
Great. Okay, so with all the kind of frameworks kind of set underneath all of us, we're going to dive into just sharing some of the key learnings that we've been doing as in the work through MetaLab, where we are doing very strategic learning and practice and evaluation of gender equity focused initiatives across Canada. And so this is an initiative that is in partnership with WAGE, which was Status of Women Canada. And it is working with a cohort of fundees that are working on issues around civic engagement. And they're doing these in kind of collective impact style projects. So they're, excuse me, they are collaborations that are taking place across the country, and they're clustered around three issues. One is access to housing. One is access to economic security, so looking at childcare and pay equity. And the third is access to justice around sexual violence. So there's multiple issues or multiple initiatives that are working within these clusters. There's 8 total initiatives across the country, and we're working on all of these issue areas. And so our work has been, one, to evaluate the impact of the systems change impact, and 2, to gather the learning about how are these initiatives doing systems change work, and what are we learning about this as we go. And it's been a very, very interesting initiative and a real privilege to work with these organizations across the country. I'm not going to get too much into like the evaluation side. We developed a whole framework. We did systems mapping across the country and built a ground up framework that is shared to evaluate the initiatives, and I'm not going to get too much into that, but the learning, the strategic learning has been guided by these questions, like what are the different relationship building tactics that are being used by the initiatives, and what are the impacts of the different approaches. 2, how are initiatives working at the landscape level? How are they influencing cultural narrative in their respective systems? The third question is what's unique about a feminist approach to systems change? And the fourth is how can systems change initiatives for gender equity accelerate and deepen their impact? So these were the guiding questions of the work that we did. And so through evaluation and through strategic learning over the course of 3 years, we have started to see some patterns now. And this is what we want to share today.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll just say then, I mean, I think given the uniqueness of the work, there is so much learning that you can share, and we're looking forward to that. So let's go for it.
Great. And so the focus here is, what are some of the patterns we see around the strategies and the impact? And from this, we start to see an emerging framework where that is, I think, really interesting for us to engage with. So just to start up, just to lay the groundwork here, around the tactics and strategies, there are kind of 5 key patterns that we saw. The first is that these initiatives were centering what we say is first voice, which is lived experience. So they were centering the perspectives of women around these issues as a starting point. Second, they were working at deepening community relationships. So in the frame of the projects that were collective impact, they were spending a lot of time deepening the relationships, the connections at the community level with other organizations, with other community members that were working. So there's a centering and deepening of relationships. The third is that then from here, these initiatives then built out strategies to work across scale. So we introduced some of those frameworks earlier on. So they were then taking on kind of tactics and interventions that were influencing practice, policy, and narrative at those multiple levels. And then 4, there was clear strategic priorities around engaging with new system actors. So really stretching to be working with unusual actors, new suspects, kind of the people they weren't typically working with. And then 5, strategic efforts to really leverage narrative shifts. And if everybody kind of thinks back over the last couple of years to, the Me Too movement, to the interest in kind of feminist priorities across the country, that was huge opportunity for leveraging narrative, and that was part of their strategy and tactics. And then we saw through evaluation and through the learning these patterns in terms of impact. So we can actually see that we are effectively impacting systems change even in 3 years. So when we talk about the long view for systems change, there are ways to see the kind of the incremental and the short-term impacts that are leading to systems change. So we saw this. One, there was an increased presence at decision-making tables. So the initiatives were being brought in as experts and into different systems and structures to influence those. 2, the initiative started to play a role as host or convener in the system. So they, as experts, are bringing and convening other actors in the system. 3, there was a huge influence on bringing kind of a gendered analysis, what we call a gender-based analysis plus, to frameworks influencing at multiple levels in the system. Also, we saw influence around practice, so new models, new ways of practicing, were starting to take place and also influencing on policy. We saw impacts around silos, so breaking silos and working collaboratively in new ways. We saw reframing of systemic issues, which is really, really important when you're working at the narrative level. And we saw influencing of narrative. So all of these were impacts that we actually saw the initiatives have.
That's fantastic. And I mean, it resonates a lot with, I'm thinking of the visual you showed earlier of the tiered levels with respect to the niche, the regime, and the landscape. And it looks like there is really a lot of richness coming out of the work that you were doing and this experience in terms of being able to identify the real influences that are taking place. So I'm wondering now if maybe we could just move to the next part of this, where we're saying, so what does this all mean? Let's try to make some sense about this.
Yes, and this is where I think, what we began to see as an emerging systems change framework that looks different than the ones we kind of see out there in the field. So one of the key patterns that we have observed in the initiatives is that scaling deep is central to their change strategies. So earlier, we talked about scale. So while scaling out includes replicating successful models and approaches, and scaling up is influencing policy and structural change, a key condition for success is moving beyond these traditional forms of strategy. So again, scaling deep involves bringing about change at the cultural and individual level, including shifting mindsets, perceptions, cultural practices, habits, and values. And so in the strategy, this was the kind of core and center of the work that they were doing. So the initiatives addressed the need to shift culture and values through these three main strategies, which we mentioned earlier, but I'll just repeat again. First was this focus on lived experience and engagement with women with direct lived experience. Second was strengthening relationships across core partners, across community organizations. And third is then building from this place, from this place of lived experience and understanding to then influence policy practice and new narratives. And these strategies then work together to create this framework, which we'll take a look at. So after sitting with this for some time, the sense that we got was that that work was deeply rooted kind of in the root systems of like a tree. It's work that is often, not seen. It's work that is quite magical and powerful. And so what we then were able to do is to map this in a way where we can see that work happening. Again, like if you look at the tree here at the bottom, and that's the scaling deep piece. And that was the beginnings and the central to the strategies. And then we can work our way up the tree to see the work that starts to intervene across multiple levels, across the scale, to then, have intervention points or we can say acupuncture points at different parts of the system to influence narrative and policy. And so then also engaging with new system actors as part of that. So that's all active kind of as in the tree trunk and in the branches. And then we can see the impacts as almost like flowers that take shape around, the leaves of the tree. And then if you go into the air, that's where kind of the narrative work happens. So this visual it offers a framework to think about, okay, what's our strategy for systems change and what is scaling deep, in the work that we're doing for systems change.
I love this visual. It's such a fantastic way of sharing this notion and idea. And as well, I love the reference to acupuncture because it's all about like eliciting energy and new energies and healing. So this is fantastic.
Yeah, I could just add, I think often we see systems change interventions, if we just go back to the tree again, that they attempt to address kind of dominant powers by directly engaging from the center of the system. So what we see that is unique is that, you know, many of the gender equity initiatives in the cohort put focus on at the level of grassroots, networks, and women's organizations. And they're privileging the voices and expertise of women who are often left out, those who are directly affected by the issue. And so this approach to systems change can be seen as decentering from the dominant power structures, and then creating multiple centers of gravity in traditionally marginalized spaces, like multiple power centers of gravity that are able to then influence change. And I think that this is, you know, this is how we can see the power and the impact of the initiatives. So then if we just go to the next scale, just to sum it up. So by scaling deep, the initiatives are shifting the power center of gravity. And what this does is it creates the space to establish new norms, to experiment with approaches, to do things differently outside of dominant structures and systems. So this is where I think we can, you know, it gets interesting for thinking about how we do systems change and how we resources and support it.
Absolutely. And also, I think now it's interesting to just talk about why do this work in this way with this lens, and really look at what are some of the opportunities that this kind of shift in thinking and approach can take in practice as well.
Great, thanks. So just briefly, you know, I think we come back again to this alignment, the alignment of values around feminist practice, around feminine approaches to leadership, that we see that there's, you know, there's alignment in intention and in what we're trying to accomplish. And so it creates an opportunity to kind of learn from the various fields. Like, I think for systems change field, there's a lot to learn about feminist practice and approaches. And at the same time, I think when we're looking at gender equity, we can also leverage systems practices. I also just want to point out that, you know, often when we're thinking about the capacities for systems leadership, we're drawing on kind of feminine qualities, right, of thinking, like around relational, around unpredictability. And it's not to essentialize feminine, but I think, you know, it's important to recognize that as we're trying to, you know, strengthen our abilities to do systems change. So there's a lot of great kind of reflection and insight in that. And specifically, I think the opportunity, if we move to the next slide, yes, then is to really leverage the learning around what it means to shift power. And because that's a central focus for kind of feminist work, that we can draw on that to think about how are we actually disrupting the status quo? How are we actually shifting power when we're trying to shift systems? And so a couple of things in terms of how the practice of systems change. So one, we can really learn a lot about the analysis, the power analysis. And what, you know, one of my reflections often when I'm kind of in the systems change world is that when we think about relationships, which are key and important, and complexity, we can lose sight of the power that's actually playing. And often, you know, when we're in spaces where we're convening, you know, there's an elephant in the room when it comes to power and who's located in the room from like the dominant systems. And so this offers a way to actually bring power into the conversation and a way to actually work with it concretely, which I think is pretty exciting.
Very exciting.
Yeah. And so just a few of the other pieces, it also brings practices around reflexivity. It's so important in systems change to understand who we are in the system and, you know, and have a critical reflection around that and an awareness. For example, we are doing an upcoming kind of workshop around interrogating whiteness, because this is an issue where, you know, in the dominant systems, especially in kind of a North American context, there are issues around race and racism that people are grappling with, and the questions around kind of whiteness and assumptions around whiteness and dominance are really important. So this is a way that we can actually start to deepen an understanding and practice around working across difference and thinking about who we are as actors in the system. Another opportunity is around centering the margins. I mean, truly in this model, you know, we're decentering dominant systems and power. And so what does it actually mean to do that, to actually invest in it, to fund it, to really take the leadership of those who are working in the margins, who are living with lived experience of the biggest challenges that we're facing, to actually have their leadership inform systems change practice and strategies, and actually start from there rather than starting from the dominant systems and trying to architect, ways to move forward. Another area I'll just say is that we can, I think in this, we have an opportunity to really focus on practices and new practices to help us with systems change. And an example of that is bridging. Often when we talk about bridgers in the system, they are in the dominant system, like they're bridging out of the dominant system, kind of bringing in new niche innovations or new ideas into the dominant system. And, I think if we think about bridging as, the actors and leaders who are actually coming from and working from marginalized communities with lived experience, that's an interesting opportunity. So there's also, it shines light on opportunities to understand systems practice to make it better. So I think there's a lot of opportunity when we're looking at this bridging between kind of feminist systems practice and systems change.
Wow, well, I love all of the the notions that you're raising around bridging, and I look forward to learning more from you as time goes on. I think we're at a point now where we're going to open it up to questions, and we encourage you to send us your own questions or comments through the question box in your control panel, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. I'm going to just ask Duncan, you're there, to moderate the question period. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for all these great comments. I'm sure there's lots of good questions.
All right, thank you both. And thanks to everyone in the audience who submitted their questions and comments. There's still an opportunity to submit your questions, so please be sure to use the Q&A panel on your Zoom client, and we'd love to get to them. The first question was submitted anonymously, and they ask, how are immigrant and newcomer communities engaged in the research? Were cultural barriers regarding the woman's role in the family impact approached?
Thank you, that's a great question. Do you mind just repeating it again, because I didn't quite catch the second part?
Sure, it was just inquiring about how you approached cultural barriers regarding a woman's role within the study.
Great. So thanks for that question. I think it's really important. It actually illuminates, I think, the importance of this work. And so by working with these initiatives across the country, they are collaboratives of women's and community organizations. And a large part of the interest for the systems change is working with diverse communities and working with racialized immigrant communities. And so the area of the work around scaling deep, when we look at strategy, and what we learned from these initiatives is that focus on understanding diverse experiences and the challenges and the system from those perspectives was key. So when we speak about the relationship building at the community level, it's within the communities that these organizations are working with. And so one of the other pieces around this is, focusing on intersectionality when we talk about feminist intersectional approaches and working across difference, the deep work to really understand what's the nature of the issue and what's the nature of the issue for those who are most marginalized in the context. For example, sexual violence. How do women who are coming from different backgrounds and contexts, socioeconomic, cultural, etc., how do they access support and resources in the justice system? It's critical and important to bring an intersectional lens to that. And that's I think the value of saying of scaling deep in this context is so important, because that's where then the work starts from around systems change. Thanks for that.
Wonderful. I have two questions that are separate but definitely related, so I'll give them both, and then we can have a chance to answer them. The first is from Catherine, and they ask, I'd be really interested in your M&E framework or strategy. How does this all roll up into results? Because that's the pushback they're getting all the time with their own systems change work. And the second is from Indira, and they ask, perhaps you'll get to this later, but I'd love to hear more about how you did the learning and evaluation of the impact of these initiatives, indicators, framework used, et cetera, especially for a lot of the change work that is less tangible.
Great questions. And I think, so this part of the work, I love it. I say I kind of geek out on it because, because it's, it gets into, the technical heady stuff, but it's important, right? And I think with systems change, it is hard because we're like, okay, it's going to take a while to shift this system. It's going to take a decade, but we want to be able to see results. And so when we developed the framework, we used a ground up approach. So we did systems mapping with the initiatives across the country and outcomes mapping, which I can't get into the detail, but I'd love to be able to share in some way with people. Maybe there's a way we can follow up on this. And then what we did is analyzed all of that and coded it and worked with two frameworks. One is the transition theory, and one is societal transformation frameworks. And so the societal transformation framework, I wish I had a visual of it for you, but it works around change that is first order change, second order change, and third order change. And that mapped onto the transition theory for us to be able to organize the indicators that came out of the outcomes mapping. So in the outcomes mapping, we found and we coded indicators that we then were able to map out. And so on the first order change, we were looking at things like knowledge building, awareness raising, and relationships. And the second order change focused on practice and policy changes. And the third order change looked at narrative and societal transformations. And so the coding allowed us to then build out shared indicators that were relevant across all the initiatives. And then through the evaluation over the 3 years, we were able to evaluate the impact within that framework. And we could see concretely, yes, very tangible successes towards systems change. And I'd be happy to follow up with those who are interested to share more about that, because I think what was really cool about it is that it was done from the ground up. So we weren't imposing this framework on top of these initiatives, but working across them and able then to see the systems change impacts across the interconnected issues of housing, justice, and economic security, which is childcare and pay equity. So there's an intersectionality also to be able to see the impacts, the evaluation impacts. I hope that helps with to answer the question. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you so much. We had a question from an anonymous user asking, are you working with partners in an Indigenous context to apply or adapt this model of approaching systems change?
That's a great question. So in this cohort, there was not a focus or a collaborative that was working from an Indigenous community. So we weren't able to kind of use that, have that work be part of the learning that we've done so far. I will say though, in the work I do with the Systems Sanctuary, I work with systems leaders in our peer learning cohorts and our capacity cohorts, and systems leaders who are Indigenous and working from Indigenous communities. And I think the framework that we've developed with the gender equity work resonates a lot because it supports centering the learning from community and the leadership from community. And certainly we can see that, in Indigenous leadership to solve the issues that we're dealing with is critical and key. So I think there's lots to be learned in the future if we can take these approaches and practice them and learn from them.
Wonderful, thank you so much for that. Our next question comes from Ginny, and they ask, wondering if Tatiana could share which tools she and her team uses to map the system of relationships.
Great. So I think well, in this case, when we were doing our mapping across the country with the initiatives, we used two. One was the iceberg map and an actor map. And that we could use those two to then, we did analysis to look at where the levers and opportunities were for systems intervention. And so the iceberg map is a way to, identify kind of problems and focus them in an event. Like you kind of identify what's an event around the problem, and then you're able then to unpack the patterns and the systemic nature of the problem, the structural nature of the problem, and the cultural levels. And then you're able to use that to build strategy across those levels as well. And the actor map is a really great tool to be able to bound the system, identify the system you're working in and the subsystems, and then to identify the actors who are acting within those subsystems, and then I analyze the relationships, like the strong relationships, weak relationships, and then also analyze the power centers. So that was really helpful for us to be able to identify, like, where's the power in this system. And often we found with the organizations, they weren't close to those power centers. So then part of building the strategy was like, how do we build, connection and relationship and strategic intervention, recognizing that. So yeah, actor mapping. And I will say that there's a huge menu of mapping tools, and depending on what your objectives are, you would then use those tools. We also use transition theory to then map strategy and to use that as a baseline for learning as we went along over the years, which was also very helpful.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question comes from Joanna, and they ask, we have seen a positive shift of funds wanting to support systems change, but as you've described, this is a long and complex and largely feminist work. What do you think are the risks if they jump on this bandwagon, and how best can we hold to true systems change?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think part of this work is about shifting the mindset of the ways in which we're working. And so in the sanctuary work that we do, which again is peer learning for systems leaders who are really in the thick of doing systems change work, often one of the challenges we see is that they're working to do systems change, but they're working in contexts or institutions that are still working in outdated ways, in very strict hierarchies, in very, rigid silos, in ways that demand like outcomes and, linear solutions, and also in very, very fast-paced environments. And so we see like the stress, we see burnout, we see overwhelm, and there's so much value in creating opportunities for systems leaders to be able to connect with each other, because often when you're doing this work, you're isolated, you're overwhelmed, you're trying to lead something. So the risk is the burnout, which is high, we see that, but we can mitigate that by really creating opportunities for systems leaders to connect, to learn from each other, to understand they're not alone, and also to share what they're learning, because that's where I think the most important opportunity for strengthening what we're doing, getting better at what we're doing, and shifting systems is in that connectivity across practitioners, but then doing that even in an ecosystem itself, where people are trying to shift the system in a similar kind of domain, that's really, really, really powerful. And I think that's key, because we don't have all the answers, but we can emerge kind of a collective intelligence about how to do this well together. And that's a very feminist approach, I think, also to systems change.
Wonderful, that's really, really interesting. Thanks for the answer to that. We have time for one more question here, and it was submitted anonymously. And they were looking for just a few more examples or places you could point us to see a real-world example of the application of the tree systems change model that we mentioned earlier in the call.
So I would say, because this is, this actually emerged, this framework emerged out of this work that we're doing, and we're still doing it. It hasn't wrapped yet. It's a 3-year initiative that is ending in 2019. I'd be happy to share the report, which can give more detail about what we learned, and more detail about the initiatives. And I think, you know, it's really, this offering is really for people who are doing community change work. It's an offering of a tool to think about, how does this relate to my work, you know, and how does this potentially relate to my work if I'm working in a context that is, you know, at more at a community level, at a grassroots level, that may be in a more marginalized context. How can I leverage this learning to think about how we're doing systems change? And I think the opportunity then is also to challenge the, you know, people who are resourcing this work to think about how they're resourcing systems change work in a way where they're actually decentering the power and investing in the leadership that comes from community and those who are experiencing the impacts of the issue directly. So yeah, it's a new framework, and I think there's lots to learn together. And so, you know, my hope is that it inspires people to think about their work, and that, you know, in the future we may be able to do some more learning around this practice area together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. We're just about at time here, so I just want to pivot quickly to a couple quick announcements, but I want to first take the opportunity to thank you both for sharing your insight and your wisdom with us. I've been on the chat client with tons of people who are just, yeah, really intrigued by this, really inspired by it, and are looking to kind of take that next step. So I think I can speak for all of us when I say thank you very much for sharing with us. Our first announcement is about an upcoming learning opportunity that's taking place September 30th to October 3rd in Vancouver, BC. It's Tamarac's Community Change Festival, and it's really a celebration of community change work that's being done across Canada and the US. We have changemakers joining us from as far as New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and Tatiana actually will be featured as an expert on one of our panels, and I'm really excited to actually meet Tatiana in person and get to know her a bit more and hear a bit more of her wisdom. But it's a really great opportunity to dive deep into the 5 interconnected practice areas that Tamarack has identified as essential to community change. And those are on the screen here: evaluating impacts, collective impacts, community engagement, collaborative leadership, and community innovation. There's a link on the screen. It'll also be included in the follow-up email if you're interested in learning more. Again, it's the Community Change Festival, and it's coming to Vancouver from September 30th to October 3rd. And that's coming up quickly, so feel free to reach out to me personally if you have any questions. Again, everyone on the call and anyone who registered and wasn't able to attend live will be receiving an email on Monday. That email will include a link to a full recording of today's call, a copy of the slides, and a collection of relevant links and resources. If there's anything in particular that you'd like to be included in that email, again, please reach out to me directly at duncan@tamarackcommunity.ca. And yeah, we'd love to hear more from you about what you thought about the webinar. So if you have any questions or concerns, again, feel free to reach out. We also do have a short survey for you after the webinar ends, and we'd really appreciate your insight. And once again, thank you both to Tatiana and Pamela for sharing with us. I really, really enjoyed this discussion.